Welcome, everybody, to this very special Interintellect Super Salon with Anne Applebaum, who's calling in from Washington, D.C. I don't know if you guys know this about me, but as a Hungarian political immigrant, Anne's work has been kind of formative for me, and I consider you a kind of reverse Tocqueville. You explain to little poor Eastern Europeans some of the intricacies of our own system, because sometimes you're just too close to it to see it for yourself. That said, since your Gulag book and Iron Curtain, which I think is my favorite, if I can pick one, a lot of these problems came home to America. And you are sitting in Washington, D.C., so you yourself are not so far from being at the epicenter of some of these developments. Today, we will talk about your new book, Autocracy Incorporated. I'm sure everybody has one, either this edition or the earlier one, but we'll also try to find out a little bit more about why autocracies even form, why they are so lindy, why they are so hard to get rid of, and what individuals like ourselves, thinkers, professionals, can even do about it without just understanding. Welcome to Interintellect, Anne.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you guys. Thank you.
Do you mind if we start a little bit with Tocqueville? Last night I stayed up a little bit and went into the more arcane parts of your scholarship and read this beautiful speech that you just gave in Salzburg in Austria. And you started with Tocqueville. And of course, as a newcomer into America, I'm a very big Tocqueville fangirl. And so I was so happy to see that as one of the foundations for your thinking as well. You talk about the matter of free association. One thing I love about America is that I actually feel that I associate more freely here than I did in Europe. Do you want to maybe say a few things about why voluntary association and friendship are so important in the formation of American life? I feel that that's central to your thinking.
So I guess if you've all read Tocqueville, this is you know some of this, but Tocqueville came to America looking for an explanation for why democracy was possible here and why the French Revolution had failed so spectacularly to bring it to France. He had been a personal victim of that. So I think it was a genuine effort to find out, and he had various answers, some of which were to do with divided and local government. But one of the most important answers as to what made democracy work in America, as he saw it in the first half of the 19th century, was that Americans very freely formed associations. And there's a line where he says something like, in anything that in France would have been done by the regime and in Britain would have been done by some great lord, in America it's done by a group of people. And he meant everything from, barn raisings and church building to funeral associations to companies to libraries to any kind of club or group or organization pulled together to achieve something in some town, and his argument, which was also echoed by Edmund Burke and by others, was that these kinds of associations were a kind of laboratory of democracy, that by practicing making decisions with people, or school of democracy, maybe is the better word, by making decisions with other people, that Americans were practicing democracy all the time, and they were learning to compromise, and they were working together in all kinds of different ways, and that this was why this was the sort of grassroots fundament on which American democracy was based. And it's obviously been true for some time that this system has been eroding. And there was a famous book written now a couple of decades ago, I guess, by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, which described the decline of certain kinds of American organizations. And I think he starts talking about bowling leagues, but it also includes, the Rotary Club and all kinds of other locally based, charities and charitable organizations and groups that are beginning to decline, thanks partly to the way capitalism works in America and gathers, people had to adjust to constant shifts. But I actually wrote, this is what I thought you were going to refer when talking about Tocqueville, about the way in which the internet has forced also this decline. And so instead of being part of groups where people are active and they take part in the governance and the writing of the rules for their organization, people now join these kind of online mobs. You join a group, you click, or your approval, you become part of nationally based or even international groups and movements that are made up of people you've never met. And the way in which people now interact with the world and in which they interact with public space has changed really dramatically. Um, and in the Salzburg speech, I was just talking about how the Salzburg Festival, which is a very particular music festival, it was born immediately after World War I. It was established as a way of giving post-war Austria, which had just lost its empire, a kind of identity. It was very much the work of groups of musicians working together and sort of lots of ordinary people working together to build and create a festival that would originally was intended to appeal to a lot of people. It's also gone through different phases. I think it's now returning to trying to be much more grassroots, became very elite at one point. But the point is that the people who built it also thought very much, and I don't know that they had ever read Tocqueville, but they thought very much that what they were doing by building this institution, that was going to bring in people, talented people from all over Europe and all over the world to Austria, was a way of building Austrian democracy. I mean, they did have that in their heads, that that through institutions, through creating links, through building, creating charities and volunteers, that this is how you build the basis for a society that isn't top down, that isn't run by one person, that in which people feel themselves to be active citizens and not just subjects, receiving orders. And so, I mean, that's how I understand it. I mean, it has to be said that idea and that interest in associations, in my case, also comes from the research I did for Anna for a book that you mentioned. I wrote a book called Iron Curtain, which is a book about how the Soviet Union took over Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War and what exactly they did. And some of what they did is surprising. I mean, we have in our heads this idea that what Sovietization was about was political repression and economic change, the nationalization of industry and so on. But actually, a part of that effort also was taking over institutions and organizations and groups of all kinds, and the Boy Scouts and the Polish Women's League and the Hungarian student associations, and they were very especially focused on student associations. And in Germany, one of the most dangerous things to be in East Germany, sorry, after around 1946, 47, was a Christian democratic youth activist, because they understood that anyone who was capable of self-organization and creating some kind of real organization separate from the state was somebody who was dangerous. And that understanding continued all the way through East Germany and all the way through the history of the Soviet Union, and it's continued by Putin's Russia today, that Putin very much thinks of any self-organized group as being, by definition, a threat or a CIA plot or something else. And the fact that we that the what well, I'll just say that it still is the case, I believe, that what makes democracies work is the fact that they allow and encourage these kinds of associations. And as I said, one of the greatest dangers to them is coming from this new way of connecting, which online, which is so very different.
It's so interesting to me how, I mean, obviously I run an internet company, so I might have a more, nuanced view on this. But Tocqueville talks a lot about religion, and that you also brought up Tocqueville at this music festival. And to me, that shows the value of the ritual, that maybe the missing component is not necessarily online versus offline, but is there like a job for the community to do? Like what we
Well,
do.
there are different forms of being
Yes.
online. So right now we're online, right? But we're in a discussion group, and I'll talk for a while because those are the rules we've agreed to. And then after that, other people will talk, and all of us will listen to that person talking. But when you're online when you're on Facebook, that's not what's happening. You're part of maybe you think you're part of a conversation, but actually there's an algorithm that's been written by somebody in California who will decide who hears what you said. And And the rules about who gets to speak and who gets to speak the loudest and who's heard the most are decided by somebody else somewhere else.
Indeed. You
And
are
so and
content.
so
You're part
and
of the
so so free
content.
associations and democratic associations make their own rules and they make their own decisions about how they want to organize their interaction. And that's not what we experience on social media. So it's sorry, I shouldn't have said the internet in the
Yes. No, no, that's all good.
it's not the internet that's the
Yes.
problem. It's
That's
the very specific model of social media that has come to dominate the internet and which I didn't dominate it at the very beginning and doesn't have to dominate it, but we have allowed it to dominate it because these companies are very, very powerful and very rich.
yes. And one thing I loved in Tocqueville was his note that if you associate freely, you will value that relationship more. He even points out that in American marriages, to his untrained eyes, there was this upside that when people are free to choose whoever they want to marry, they will be more loyal and more appreciative of that relationship. I find,
In theory, yeah.
in theory, I mean, to his cursory view through his road trip. And I find that about interact definitely that we made these rules, we agree to them, we associate freely, and people don't break those rules.
Right. And if they do, then, we kick them out. I mean,
Exactly. The other people can be like, hey, I
but
participated in making these rules, don't break them.
yes. No, but you asked about the ritual aspect. So so the Salzburg Music Festival does have it has a weird resonance that not all music festivals have. And I said that's to do with the moment of its founding and who founded it, the very distinguished Austrian directors and musicians of the time, Richard Strauss and Hofmannsthal and others. So it has a role in how Austria was recreated as a new nation after World War One. And so it has there is a opening concert with people from around the world, and there's a ceremony. And so, I mean, I wouldn't call it religious, though. I mean, I think there's a difference between that and religion. I think it's more of a civic ritual, and those which might also be necessary for maintaining a sense of community and for fighting polarization. Civic rituals had that function in the United States for a long time too. Whatever it was, raising the flag or saying the Pledge of Allegiance or celebrating the 4th of July, which is still done there's a neighborhood in Washington where they still they read the Declaration of Independence every year in the public park. And I know lots of small towns in the United States do that too. So, yeah, I mean, civic rituals can also be part of maintaining a kind of civic culture, but, they work because they're based on real institutions. I mean, the Salzburg Festival is a real thing. I mean, there are lots of people who work for it, and the reading of the 4th of July, in the Somerset neighborhood happens because there's a little committee of people who make it happen. So
And it's so counterintuitive, but when you have agreed to the rules, right, in a democratic way, you will also be more tolerant of difference. There is this kind
well,
of like
also when
you
you've
learn
agreed
how
to
to coexist in a
you
way.
can learn how to coexist, but also it's very important that there be some kinds of interactions between citizens that where the arguments aren't existential.
Hmm.
So when we're arguing about existential issues that can't be resolved, I don't know whether they're religious, whether they're religious or whether they're to do with the definition of the nation and what kind of a nation we are, then people will kill each other. When we're discussing where the bridge should be built, or should the community center go on that side of the road or that side of the road, then we might have very bitter disagreements, but we aren't likely to end up by murdering one another. And that's, for example, I mean, this was one of the lessons from Northern Ireland. So
Hmm.
one of the ways in which peacekeepers in Northern Ireland tried to bring communities together, probably not entirely successfully, but after there was a kind of peace treaty and the terrorism subsided, one of the things they tried to do was to bring people together, not to discuss the nature of Ireland. Is Ireland Irish or is it
Yeah.
British? Northern Ireland,
That
because that's
never
the
leads to a good place.
don't talk about that, but talk about, as I said, should the road go east or west of the highway? And when you're talking, again, very bitter people disagree and all kinds of other issues come into play and people don't want the road next to their house or whatever, but people are unlikely to murder one another because of that. Whereas they were likely, and they were in fact murdering one another over whether Northern Ireland is British or Irish.
Don't mention the war, as they say. I found this review of one of your books in, I think, Twilight of Democracy in LA Review of Books that calls you a party girl. And it starts with this very interesting little aside, like, oh, few people know this about Anne Applebaum, that you're actually a party girl. And Twilight of Democracy is kind of bookended by two very significant
You
parties
know,
talking about civic rituals. And it's just the era that I myself went through a similar, obviously, as a Hungarian millennial. The millennial era itself was so hopeful, and you could actually throw house parties with multiple different sides, and they were completely fine, and they were absolutely not murdering each other. They were just having, heated discussions about where the punch bowl should go, and then kind of cut to a few years later, and that ability to come together or
mhm.
tolerate those differences is just gone.
Yeah, no, so that was the way my that book began. And forgive me, I've now talked about this party a lot of times.
Thank you for
That
revisiting these famous
no, the
parties
book
for us.
the book began with a description of a party, and actually it was quite a scruffy party. It wasn't a fancy party at all. It was a millennial party in 1999, and so the idea was to, celebrate the turning of the 1999 into
Some
the
of these guys
2000s.
were not even born yet.
No, most of you were probably
Ever.
not born. And so, and the, and we invited a very wide range of people, and some of them were Polish and some of them were British, and there were actually a few Americans who came. And everybody felt to me then like we were all more or less a milieu. We were all kind of on the same side. And this was, a decade after the fall of this was in Poland. I have a house in the Polish countryside, which at that time it has one very big room, and at that time the room had no furniture in it. And so the party was in the unfurnished
That's
room.
perfect. That's how parties should be thrown.
That's exactly what it was. And this was in an era, there weren't caterers. We made all the food. And so, but there was about, I don't know, it was 100 people or 120 people, something like that. And the book, the story, I do write about the party in the book just for fun, but the real issue is that a few years after that, there were such divisions in Poland, and there had been the creation of such bitter politics elsewhere too, which I also write about, that
Mhm.
many of the people who were at that party are people I will never speak to again. And some of them have written horrible things about me and my husband in the Polish far right press. And there was a group of people who kind of migrated from being anti-communists, which is what all of us were, and being more or less in favor of Poland becoming a democracy and a free society and a, important, country integrated into the rest of Europe. And then there was a number of people who went a different direction. And it happened in the 2000s. Probably it happened in the little later than that, but certainly by 2015, it was very obvious. And some of them were people that I knew in an earlier stage. And because I had witnessed this same phenomenon in other countries, and so I was in the I was spent many years in the UK, and I knew people on both sides of the Brexit argument, which was at that time was very bitter. It was a little bit less bitter because it was a little bit less existential, but and I also knew lots of Hungarians and saw the same thing happen there, and a version of it happened in the United States as well. And so the book was an attempt to explain why that happens. And the very often the answer is to do with disappointment. So either personal disappointment, people who were um, felt they had been members of the Solidarity opposition movement, and so they should be prime minister, but they hadn't got to be, or whatever, or they should be best-selling authors. Some of it was kind of more existential disappointment. There were Poles and Hungarians who were disappointed with what the post-communist world looked like. It wasn't what they imagined. The capitalism was grubbier than they thought it was going to be. The EU was uglier than they wanted it to be, or it was full of immigrants who they didn't expect to see, or something. I mean, there was many different layers of this. Um, or modern Britain wasn't the great power that people believed it ought to be, and it shouldn't be having to make co-decisions with other countries. And so there was a either it was an existential or personal or kind of patriotic disappointment that people had and made them start to. And this is, by the way, this is a book absolutely about intellectuals. It's not a book about voters or people, out, it was a very small group. It was an attempt to explain the phenomenon of far right intellectuals, and who often came from the center right. And I kind of more or less was on the center right. And so the book was about what happened to the center right in several countries. And anyway, they were all people who were educated and they were spoke lots of languages. And so, I mean, you can't say that this was some product of ignorance or some economic disappointment. I mean, most of them weren't. They were not suffering from the closure of the local factory, is the point. So this is a different one. And most and I don't know that I captured every nuance. And honestly, to this day, I look at people who I used to know, or even people who I watch from afar, and I watch what they're doing. And even though I've wrote a whole book about it, and then I wrote another article in the Atlantic a few years ago about the phenomenon of collaboration and why people collaborate. Even though I did all that, still sometimes I find it mystifying. Still I sometimes find the contortions that people make to in order to agree with stuff they used to hate. I find hard to understand.
It's
But
very hard.
that was the subject of the book.
It's emotionally very hard. And then you wonder, have they gone insane or are they lying? And which one is better?
Yeah, and what's their real motive? And it can be hard to understand, or do they really believe it? And who knows? And anyway, that's
Hard.
where I am. But that book was an attempt to grapple with this subject, in as it manifests itself in kind of 2015, 16, 17.
Yeah. And
And
that's
we're a
why
little
I'm
further along now.
also not really buying this kind of tribal evolutionary psychology take on, oh, America had or the West had this common enemy in the form of the Soviet world. And after the Cold War, everybody fell at each other's throats because it actually happened much later. I mean, even in your analysis, right? It's like at least 10, 12 years after the
I think
fall of the
something
wall.
particular happened on the right. The left is a different subject, and people who are on the left can also have different, they can talk about what happened there. That's a different story. But there was something that happened on the right, and it took a decade or so. Maybe thanks to the war on terrorism, it was extended longer. But there was something that happened on the right, which was that people on the right, or center right, I should say, the anti-communists, Thatcherites, Reaganites,
And that was
they
your group at the
that
time.
was my more or less, I mean, with some nuances. People on the center right, were all fighting communism, but as it turned out, they were doing it for different reasons. And so some people were doing it because they were Christians and they believed Marxism was, satanic, and some people were doing it because they liked liberal democracy and thought that was a better political system, and there were different reasons. And there was another thing that happened, which is and so of course they began to drift apart, those groups, because then they had different goals after 1990. But then there's another thing that happened, which is that um, there are also different reasons why people are in politics. And some people, when after the Cold War ended and they could stop screaming and yelling, said, right, now it's time to rebuild Europe, and we need to build a really good train connection between Warsaw and Berlin, and we need to we need to integrate our economies and so on. And that's what they were doing. And then there were other people who saw that happening and were immensely bored by it, and they missed being culture warriors, and they missed feeling like they were the avant-garde, fighting some big existential cause. And and they and they needed something else, that politics that was about um, you know,
Struggle.
they needed struggle, they needed, drama, and
Mm,
post Cold War Europe
yeah.
didn't initially seem to offer that kind of drama.
It's like
Um,
Richard
and
III. He comes home from the war. He doesn't look good enough for the Renaissance court where you have to have all the pleasant qualities. And he's like, okay, I'm going to mess this up.
Something like that, and you can see it in their evolution. I mean, so the war on terror, I think, postponed this reckoning because, at least in the United States, but also partly in Europe, it gave people like, okay, here's another enemy we can all fight together. And it's really now after that petered out or turned out to be not quite what we thought it was, or a lot of mistakes were made. Um, it was really after that that you began to get these very dramatic shifts. And that's, I think, why you get 2015, 2016, this, very big changes.
I love how in Twilight of Democracy, we have this almost kind of platonic exploration of friendship and how friendship works on the ideal level as a kind of a grounding of all political association, and then how it actually works in the real lives of real people who are making career decisions, who are sometimes betraying their own previous ideals, alienating some friends, gaining new ones. I mean, I'm in American tech, and you can imagine what's going on in my group chats. It's very much reshuffling, and sometimes to a really, really shocking degree. But you're also critiquing, especially in Autocracy, I mean, incorporated in the title, this idea that not many people explored before you, which is that association is also not always good. For instance, when dictatorships become really good friends with each other, that might be a problem. And you start, which I found very interesting, I didn't know about this idea of Wendell durch Handel, peace through trade, that was apparently a kind of mid-Cold War policy in West Germany when they thought that, oh, let's just cooperate with the
Yeah,
East
they built pipelines at
and
West
everything will be
Germany had
fine.
built pipelines with the Soviet Union, partly for economic reasons. They got cheap gas that way, but also because at the time there was a very deep belief in West Germany that if we have a kind of permanent trading relationship with the USSR, they won't invade us. I mean, that was the reason. And
That never
that
worked, but
morphed
maybe
into
now it
what.
will. And but the Americans at the time were very much against it. You go through various presidencies, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, who were not so game about this at the time.
Well, they were very suspicious of it. They thought, the West Germans are going to do a secret deal with Russia or something. They were always worried about the loyalty of Germans. But they didn't block it though.
Today, we seem to be a little bit more tolerant of autocratic regimes. I think, especially American commentators who are often very innocent about this because they might not have personally experienced how a dictatorship actually works being on the ground, like to position this as something where the American presidency is benevolent toward foreign dictators and somehow helps their regimes. Whereas in your system, it's more like there is free association if you are an autocratic leader, and you will be able to build
So
out
yeah,
this.
so let me make a distinction. So when
Yes.
I talk about a network of autocrats, I mean this is nothing to do with an association between ordinary people where they get together and build a church together. Okay, so this is what the book is about, a network, how leaders of actually very different societies. We're talking about communist China and nationalist Russia and theocratic Iran. Talk about how they help one another, keep how the stronger dictatorships keep the weaker ones going. How the North Koreans and the Iranians and the Chinese have kept the Russian war effort in Ukraine going, and so how they work together. I'd also like to make a distinction between when I talk about those kinds of countries, like full dictatorships, which don't really, well, they all pretend to be democracies, but which are, about which there's no doubt. And there's a difference between that and even a country like Hungary, where there is still a lot of free speech and, free movement, and where there is an opposition party, even though it's under huge, extraordinary pressure. There's a difference between that and Russia, where the opposition is killed. And there's also a difference between that and when we talk about autocratic practices in the United States, we're talking about the American president or people around him breaking the rules or ignoring the checks and balances that are supposed to check the power of the American president. Or and we're talking in some case breaking the laws or breaking the norms of past behavior. And in all these things, the real turning point is elections. And you know in Hungary, Viktor Orban altered the system, so actually Hungary is still very open in many ways, but it's very, very hard for technical reasons and other reasons for anybody to win an election against Viktor Orban. And the fear here is also that the Trump administration will change the rules and maybe intimidate people, and that's a whole long other subject I can talk about if you want, in order to make the midterms unfair or in order to shape the landscape. And that's different, this kind of shaping of the political landscape and manipulating elections is different from Russia, where they just steal them. So and it's not really, there's a kind of, maybe there's a kind of pretend campaign, but there's not really an opponent, and we don't have any doubt about who's going to win. So I think it's important to preserve these nuances. And so when I talk about an autocracy, I'm not talking about the United States, just to be clear, or Hungary. I mean, Hungary has an autocratic minded leader who is seeking to preserve power indefinitely, but his political system is not the same as that of North Korea.
Thank you for that distinction. That's a little bit reassuring to me. I have one more question left, and then I'm going to open the floor. So if anybody has questions, you are welcome to ask it in the Zoom chat, or just raise your hand. That's my preference. You can find the hand raise feature under React. One of the most interesting things in this system that you built, and to me, is this idea that these leaders learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
This was my like when I viewed my own country's descent into this kind of semi-autocracy that you so beautifully define here, I felt almost this kind of meta. You use you use metastasizing as a kind of metaphor in the book for kleptocracy, but that Orban comes up with an idea, and 2 months later it's happening in Turkey. Putin says something. There was a wonderful piece in the New York Times around 10 years ago, where the author claimed that everybody is learning from Egyptian dictators, that this is the Egyptian playbook that, Nasser Sadat Mubarak came up with throughout the 20th century, and it's there for the taking. And actually, Putin, Erdogan, Orban, they are just doing this. And then you see the other regimes learning from it. So I'm really interested in how, like, with the internet, with everybody speaking English, with information being instantaneous, there kind of is no way to stop bad political actors from learning from each other. But they
No,
seem
I
to be
mean
doing it faster than the good ones.
no, they copy one another. I mean, it's even more than that. I mean, so China sells surveillance technology to lots of other countries. The Russians actually sent Russian journalists into Belarus to prevent Belarusian journalists from revolting against the regime. North Koreans sent troops to Russia in order to help them, take back that Kursk district of Russia that the Ukrainians had captured. So there's, it's a, it's pretty active. And I mean, I don't think we should be thinking in terms of how to stop it, stop them watching one another and copying one another and helping one another. I think it's more important for us to begin to think about what's the alternative and what are the alternative coalitions. I mean, there are coalitions among Democrats as well, and they also imitate one another and copy one another, and for good reasons. And I think it's important to think about how they work and how we can make them work better, because a lot of them are based on outdated institutions, or especially those built in the 20th century, that don't function well anymore. I'm thinking about like the OSCE. There's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which I don't know when it was really last functional. I mean, I guess if there were ever a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, it would be the OSCE that would monitor the ceasefire. That's the kind of role they've had. But it's so clear that there's a need for some better pan-European organization that works in some more flexible way, and that it could include EU and non-EU countries, and in some kind of they could work out policies together. And I think it's also important for them to think in terms of not who's in the EU or who's in NATO or who's in the OSCE, but what are the issues that we need to tackle, and what allies can we find to tackle them?
And to me, the question is like, who is the moral leader of Europe? Like, who are the moral leaders? Because there's also a kind of vacuum there, no?
I don't know. I don't know. Does Europe need a moral leader, or does it need more unitary leadership? I don't know.
Mm, yes.
It's interesting. I mean, there are, I don't know, I think there are some good leaders in Europe now. There are good people who speak for Europe, but Europe has a fundamental problem, which is that it's actually not a federation. It's not a federal state or a federal anything. It's a confederation, which is what the United States was actually until the Constitution was written, until 1789. And so you have some coordinated policy, but you actually have a lot of policy made by the individual capitals. And and you still are in the situation where one state or country can veto what everybody else wants to do. And that's what's happening now, actually. The Hungarians are able to veto or block a lot of what the EU wants to do for Ukraine. And you also have a new phenomenon that's developed over the last month or so of the Belgian government, probably under huge American and Russian pressure, stopping the rest of the EU from using frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine. So one state is capable of blocking all the others. Um, and that system has worked fine for a long time, but it doesn't really work in a situation where Europe is under just enormous military and economic pressure. And
Also, Belgium sometimes doesn't have a government for 6 months. We like to forget about that.
it'd be
So
nice if Belgium didn't have a government right now, actually. That'd be better. But
it didn't when I lived there, and nobody noticed. Life went on, nobody cared. Jamie, you have your hand up. You will be my first, and then Jess and Leslie.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, Anne. I've been appreciating your work for a long time. And I was really enjoying reading your book and had a bunch of questions. And then I read the USA National Security Strategy. I live in the UK,
mhm.
and the national security strategy that came out a few days ago kind of put all my questions firmly into the background. And because I was looking at it through the lens of having been reading Autocracy Inc. and seeing some ways in which it kind of falls in line with what you're saying about,
Yep.
this loose affiliation of autocrats, some ways in which it goes against it. So I came onto this call just really wanting to hear your thoughts about the NSS and what it means, particularly what it means for Europe, to your point about strong leadership and that sort of thing. Like how do you see this playing out? What should we expect? Any thoughts would be very, very welcome.
So I'm trying to write something about it now. The NSS, the National Security Strategy, which take with a little grain of salt, like these are written strategies and they don't necessarily, you know, they don't always have deep meaning or importance. I mean, this one I think might, but it feels a little bit like more than one person wrote it. You know how there's like biblical scholarship where you can find different strands of thinking, and this kind of
The
reminded me of
Talmudic
that.
hypertext.
That's right. But it's more than one person wrote it, and there's some passages about saying we need to work with Europe and Japan and Korea on issue X or Y, and we need to get our allies to do it. And then there's another whole section about Europe in particular, which is really about the need to overthrow existing European governments and replace them with something that we like better. And the strange thing about the description of Europe is that it's even a description that is too far to the far right. I mean, it's not even what the far right would say in Europe. It's a kind of, civilizational erasure, and Europe not being European it's sort of there's an edge of madness about it. And I think that all those passages must have been designed for a domestic audience. There's some online podcasting audience that has been saying all this stuff, and this is what they're responding to. I mean, the I'd say there were two disturbing things about it. One was this description of Europe, the implication of it. I mean, especially given that elsewhere in the document they say things like, "We don't. It's not our business to decide whether worry about the nature of other countries' political systems, and we're not going to tell you whether Saudi Arabia should be a democracy or a monarchy. That's their problem." And then simultaneously, the only part of the world where they are interested in what kind of states are in charge is Europe, and they don't name names in the published document, but apparently in another earlier version of the document, they do talk about trying to pry away particular countries from the EU. They talk about Italy, Austria, Poland, and Hungary, actually. Um, and they talk about prying them out of the EU, and they imply that there are essentially that European governments need to be overthrown, and part of U.S. foreign policy should be to overthrow them to help the far right opposition win. And I'm guessing that's France, Germany, and the UK mostly. And one doesn't quite know what to make of this. I mean, we've seen the tech companies, we've seen Elon Musk be part of already a movement to promote the far right in those three countries and everywhere else as well. The question is whether, would the US government do it? And there certainly are, there's a lot of money for public diplomacy, sponsored speeches, events, and so on that could be used to promote European far right, and maybe that's what they'll do. I mean, if you went really a lot farther, I don't know. I mean, could there be covert operations that are designed to overthrow the government of Germany? I mean, I don't know. Could there be cyber attacks in the UK that are designed to somehow damage Keir Starmer and help Nigel Farage? I mean, I don't know. I mean, it seems very far-fetched, but the fact that this goal of US foreign policy is in a document means that you'd have to, if you were France or Germany or the UK, you should probably start worrying about that. Or at least take it, when you're doing your long-term planning, take into consideration that possibility. And this, of course, creates a whole new world in which the United States is not an ally of anybody, actually, but is a kind of loose international actor which is unpredictable, ready to use violence, not always clear whether it's in American interests or the interests of the Trump family. And it makes the US into a problem for everybody. And the idea that the US would then somehow in the future be able to get its allies together to do X or Y project becomes a lot more difficult. And so I suppose that's the most disturbing thing about the document. The other worrying thing is the absence of, I mean, they talk about trade competition with China, but it really evades the question of military competition and strategic competition with China in Africa or in Latin America. And also, there's almost no discussion of Russia at all. I mean, the only mention of Russia is in the context of European countries being unable to deal with Russia, something like that. And so this is clearly a document written by people who don't see, who aren't worried by the campaign of Russian sabotage in Europe or by the violence of Russia's war in Ukraine or by the Russian violent influence spreading all over the Sahel and multiple countries in Africa. They're not worried by Russia's role in the world of cybercrime. There are all kinds of dangers that the US could also face that just aren't mentioned in this document. I mean, China also has a cyber espionage and huge program aimed at the United States, collects huge amounts of data in the United States as well as Europe. And it's almost like this document sees China as some kind of benign trading rival and doesn't see these other aspects of what China does or of what Russia does. And again, I don't really know whether that's because the people who are writing the document aren't interested in it or because they're looking for some kind of deal with Russia or China. But I mean, if they are, it's a real, I mean, then you're really in a fantasy world. Um, you know, um, Doing a deal with Russia or making some kind of pact with Russia is like making a pact with a completely unreliable nation, which can turn on you at any moment. And just ask anybody who invested in Russia in the past. Of course, that's the kind of state the US is at risk of becoming as well, is this sort of unreliable, somewhat dangerous power with unpredictable urges which is not working to ensure global stability or prosperity, and as people assumed it did in the past. And so that's that's my takeaway from that document. Again, I mean, grain of salt. I don't think everybody believes this. the US military is still extraordinarily integrated with allies. I mean, in all kinds of levels, all over the place, in all kinds of ways. There are US European trading relationships that are way nothing to do with the government, very deep, very old. I was just reading a history of, I mean, it's what's now Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan and was Morgan Grenfell, this kind of banking house that was British and American from the very beginning and remained that for a very long time. And there are kind of these deep trading links and relationships that go on. And there are also lots of Americans and lots of Europeans who want to be allies, I mean, and who feel they share a world of values and so on. But, the document does seem like it's aimed to undermine that and degrade it. And I just don't know why. I mean, in whose interest is that? I mean, it's certainly not in the interest of, maybe it's in the interest of some tech companies who want to break up the EU, thereby to have, to evade regulation. Maybe I mean, it's clearly in the interest of the Russians who've been trying to break up America and Europe for, 50 years. Um, but I don't see why it's in the interests of most Americans. It's not going to be good for us economically or in our terms of our security either.
It seems like an identity formation question, almost as if the old Cold War, empires at each other's throats set up would no longer suffice because it would stop trade or some kind of other allegiance. And it's easier. I mean, this is Stalinism, right? It's not the other end of the ideological spectrum that will be attacked. It's the moderates, right? The
Yeah,
movement,
no. Well,
it's the
well, that's a
moderates.
different issue. But I mean, yeah, no. I mean, these are people with extreme views who favor a different kind of political system, attacking people who believe in liberal democracy, and you know
Yeah.
that's a very old struggle. I mean, that goes back 100 years.
Well, I have my own gripes with degrowth, and I have had many, many, many debates about this with my economist friends in Brussels when I lived there. But I do think that they are going way, way too far. Jess, another person with the Brussels trauma, come on in.
Thank you. Yes, I used to live in Brussels as well too when they did not have a government. I was there at NATO for a little bit. And thank you
This
so
happens
much for
relatively shockingly over there. It's easy to live there when they don't have a government.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm a big fan of your work and I read you a lot in the Atlantic and your Substack. And I've recently been reading your kleptocracy tracker, which is so shocking. And I don't think a lot of people are covering it as well. Like there's not a lot of coverage, I think, of what's happening with that. But I'm glad for the last question because it kind of rolls into this question that I have, which is really kind of an overall like what happens next, like where is the accountability here, because you're seeing a lot of like this kleptocracy happen and then everything with the national security and then just everything that's occurring, but then Trump is going to the ICC to ask for immunity. He's getting away with things, and we're living in this like post-truth society. Hillary Clinton was talking a lot about like TikTok and such. So even if we tried to hold him accountable, there could be people that could say, oh, it's fake news, this stuff didn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, even if the United States is able to vote uh, Trump and his ilk out of office, like how do we hold them accountable? How do we move past this to get like to work with our allies again to like rebuild the credibility of the United States in an international realm? Is it possible? Are people thinking about this? Or I don't know. I'm just like kind of worried about it as I think about it in this world that we're living in, that like that there's not going to be any accountability. I'm not expecting him to be like, you know, shot and quartered and such, but like I'm just worried about like accountability
Yeah, well, I mean,
in the future.
one of the reasons we are where we are is there wasn't accountability for January the 6th. I mean, there, that some of the rioters went to prison, but the people who organized it didn't. And so, I think that explains a lot of where we are today. Once he wasn't imprisoned or wasn't charged with anything, it made a lot of people felt like, well, then nothing bad really happened, right? Because the system would have done something if he had been. And this is other countries are drawing conclusions from that mistake. I mean, this is, I think, why you've had the indictment of Bolsonaro in Brazil. He tried a similar, this is the former Brazilian president who tried a similar assault on his system. And it's also why in Poland you have some prosecution of corruption from a previous government as well. I mean, here it'll be I almost feel like I'm not ready to talk about this yet because I feel like there's a long way to go before we get to the moment where we could even really have this conversation. Um, you know, the I'd rather focus on like how to make sure the midterms aren't stolen or not stolen, but not manipulated. I'd like to get the Democrats to focus on, to think about how to speak to people and reach people in this unbelievably difficult information environment. I sort of feel like I'd like to do all those things first and worry about accountability if we're ever in a position to talk about it. I mean, clearly this just destruction of public, the infrastructure of public ethics and the removal of civil servants will be very hard to fix. Again, I know this from Poland where I lived part of the time, and even there, it's very hard to fix. Once you have destroyed the idea of a meritocratic civil service, once you have, in their case, it was to do with the judicial system. I mean, once you have created confusion about who is really a judge and who's not a judge, it becomes very hard to fix. So I'm not gonna say it was easy. I mean, we would need a bipartisan and broad coalition of people who wanted to fix it. We would need, I mean, I'm really hoping what I would really like to see is I don't want to talk about a constitutional convention or anything like that because
I would
that's too,
love that.
but I mean, I would like people to see this as a real turning point moment when there need to be some big fixes to the way democracy works in the United States. End gerrymandering forever, especially at the state level. Maybe bring in ranked choice voting so that not all voting is so polarizing. Find some ways to mitigate that, and then of course regulate the social media companies, and think about them as the huge dominant monopolies in the way that we thought about the so-called trusts, the railway trusts and the banking trusts as huge dominant monopolies at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and fight them for the same reasons that they are squeezing ordinary people and small businesses out of work, and they're doing a lot of damage to our national conversation. But again, we're pretty far from that, but it's something that I hope people do think about while there's still time.
You realize how many things work because we believe it works. Some of this breakdown, both in Hungary and here, remind me of this moment in Jurassic Park when the dinosaurs realize that there is no more electricity in the fence. Like one realizes, and then they just there's this moment when they realize like, oh, nothing. There's impunity.
A friend of mine used to say when the velociraptors learn how to turn the knob, right?
Oh yeah, exactly. That we're all thinking about Jurassic Park here, which is
Yeah.
not a good sign. That's not what you want to think about when you think about democratic institutions. To respect everybody's time, I'm going to take Leslie, Mary, and Jean-Bord one after the other, and Anne, you pick your question, okay?
Okay.
And Neil, you can ask in Zoom, and we will add you to that as well.
And thank you so much for your time. So I am originally from China and I moved back to the States during COVID. So I spent a lot of time thinking, how can the US be autocracy proofing at the same time still remain competitive to China in terms of where everything's heading in AI, economy, military, etc. And then I got super alerted when I see where everything's heading in this country. Do you believe the grassroots civic action that you mentioned can be scaled up? This loose free association that you mentioned. And we're already seeing, when it comes to data center build out, there are a lot of community that are against this type of big infrastructure build out. And then how do you see the balance between the two? Thank you.
I mean,
Yeah,
I'd have
China.
to. You would have to
You're
look.
taking
Oh,
this?
you would take it. Okay. Well, no,
Go,
you
go,
want
go.
another. Do
Go,
another.
go,
Let's do
Sarah.
one other, and then
Okay. Sorry, Mary.
I just want to go back to the beginning and understand why associations fail and how we can prevent association fatigue.
hmm I mean, I guess those are related questions, actually. I mean, you know, gr grassroots action works when, or associations work when they have a specific goal and people have bought into them. I mean, vaguely organized protest can sometimes protests matter. I mean, they made a big difference in Ukraine in 2014. Sometimes they don't. Um, Civic organizations are ones that work together all over a long period of time to achieve specific goals. And so the ones that are the most thoughtful about what they want and how they want to do it are the ones that are most effective and also keep people most engaged. I guess that's the best way to put it. And I kind of I went to look at some of the protests, that the No Kings protests, and although I could see some people were having fun at them, and that's good. It's and people liked being in a large crowd, and I guess that's good too. I was worried about them because they were very amorphous. There didn't seem to be a goal to them. Nobody was collecting names to go on and do X or Y. They didn't have a, they didn't have a there was nothing specific about it. And I feel that a lot of I mean, funny enough, the one form of protest since in the last year that has really mattered and had a huge and visible impact was the attacks on Tesla. I mean, I think Musk said it a couple of days ago, that actually it was when people were attacking Tesla cars and boycotting Tesla shops that had a big, that changed him. And in a way that makes sense because it's targeted. It's clear. It's like we know why you're doing that. And there was also something always hypocritical. There was some big hypocrisy about Tesla being advertising itself as a, environmentally good cause when you had Musk working for an administration that was rolling back all kinds of environmental considerations. So it worked as a target. I mean, not just because of Musk, but because it drew attention to the right things. And so but not all associations are protest movements either. I mean, some of them are, designed to, as I said, build a bridge or elect a candidate or bring people together around a particular issue in a community. And the ones that are the most effective are the ones that have the clearest goals, I think. Um,
And of course,
uh,
not having dynamic enough environmental policy in certain states in the US, for instance, how difficult it is to build things in California, is not helping the
no,
case
that's
of reasonable discussion
no,
because
no, it's true. But did most people, did people vote for more pollution? I mean, they probably didn't think they were voting for
yeah,
that, but
yeah.
that's what they might get. So.
So we got a very good question from Jombor about digital democracy and fluid digital communities, but I think that was answered earlier in this conversation when Anne discussed her differentiation between social media and the internet as it is, and I think
No, I'm in favor of digital democracy, and I could
okay.
imagine a lot of ways in which the internet could be used creatively by politicians, to have public conversations. And there are a couple places that have tried it, including Taiwan. Um, they're
Estonia,
weirdly,
right?
sorry.
Did Estonia try something around that as well, right?
Estonia has digital identification, so you have a digital ID that is based on blockchain. And I don't know why everybody doesn't have that. I was thinking the other day when I had my passport getting on a plane, I was like, why do I still need this?
Why do
It's
I have
kind
a
of
little paper book that can be
exactly a
lost?
little paper book and they stamp in it. It
Yes.
seems so strange. Actually, Ukraine has a very good digital ID system as well, which has been really important because people are so dispersed.
Do you
But
see
they
Mamdani? That was the last question. Do you see Mamdani as like a hopeful answer to the question of like how to do democracy via the internet a little bit better, involving TikTok and Gen Z and
So
otherwise?
yeah, I don't think Mamdani will work everywhere in every constituency in the country, and then this is sort of, but quite apart from his views and whatever it is that he does when he's mayor of New York. Yeah, obviously it's clear that he thought a lot about how to use the internet in a way that was not didn't make people angry, and it made people feel included. And he addressed a lot of different communities. You know, what that somebody sent me, I have an Indian friend who lives in New York, and she sent me an amazing, I guess it was a TikTok video or an Instagram video, probably both, that he did in Hindi. And it was addressing Hindi voters, and it used a scene from a Bollywood movie in a really intelligent way. And you know, I was impressed by the kind of mastery of it. I don't know whether that was his idea or somebody else's, but yeah, I mean, you know, in a perfect world, we'd have better ways to communicate, but we don't. And so for the moment, those politicians who know how to reach people using these tools and who can do it in a I mean, actually, I thought I know that there are things about Mamdani that people don't like, but I thought mostly his campaign was very positive and cheerful in a weird way. It was kind of, um, yeah. And I don't know whether he's going to be a good mayor or not, but I'm open to seeing what he does.
Thank you so much. May I end this one? I just found this thing yesterday on Instagram. It's Rachel Kushner posted this about it's a kind of spoof on Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which I
Hmm.
know is many people's favorite. If you can have a favorite post-apocalyptic movie or and book, that's the one.
It's one of my sons. It's his favorite
Really?
book. Yeah.
Oh, I think there's something about like male virtue in this book that really, really resonates with people. And Kushner looks at the female virtue. She says, The Road is Cormac's best known, most gripping, and effective work of fiction. It's also my least favorite for its grim and at times repugnant portrayal of human nature. In Cormac's original, the post-apocalyptic turn is to brute force and bare life. In this small print run version, he specifically wrote for women. The worldview is Gramscian rather than Hobbesian. Humans contain a capacity for grace. Intellect is collective. The people are resourceful students of a post-state rebirth. The road still leads to the sea, but the encounters along it promise love instead of violence, strangers who greet us as friends, and a future worth living for. I
That
thought,
sounds very appealing.
I thought that as far as post-apocalyptic visions go, we are all we have,
No,
right?
no, I mean, well, there's another version of that. There's an essay by an Italian writer called Ignazio Silone called The Choice of Comrades, which I recommend if you haven't read it. Some of it's a little stuffy and meandering, but the main point of it is he's somebody who had been a communist, and then he was very disappointed by the Communist Party, and then he might have flirted even with fascism, and then he was disappointed by that. And he's writing in Italy, I guess, you know, 5 or 6 years after the war. And Italy, post-war Italy was very um, it was very you know, the mafia had taken over, and it was very ugly politics. And so you know, so what does an idealistic person do? And then the thesis of the essay is that what you need to do is find the people that you like, and you stick with those people and you move forward. And that's how you do politics. And that essay is at the end of my book, Twilight of Democracy. It's quoted. So it's the same idea.
You did the COVID thing and spoke when I was muted. It's about the friendship. And I love that you notice as the first symptom the breakdown of the friendship. And this was why I started Interintellect. I was a screenwriter and I didn't understand why, since Aristotle, we have understood how to write good dialogue for fictional people so they get along and understand each other. And we don't use that knowledge for real people. That made no sense to me. So here we are doing that every day. And Applebaum, thank you so much for all you do. We love reading you. We love agreeing you. We love disagreeing with you. Hope you will be back with your next book. I know you're very prolific. And let's go back to work. I think that's my takeaway from this conversation. And attendees, incredible questions, points. I shared the Rachel Kushner story about the picture. This was not my choice. I found it on the internet. This has been delightful. And good luck with the rest of your many meetings today.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you all. Thank
Great
you.
to meet you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.